Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and Jews for Secular Democracy is our pluralistic initiative. If folks are new and haven't heard of any of those organizations, the Society for Humanistic Judaism is the organizing body for a denomination of American Jewry. It is mostly secular and cultural Jews and humanists and family and friends, and we've been around for over 60 years. Our initiative, Jews for Secular Democracy, is pluralistic in that we want to incorporate all of the spectrum of Jewish ideas, beliefs, and practices, because the goal is to bring Jewish voices to advocate to maintain the separation of church and state in America. And we felt like this was a value that we shared as Jews in America across denominational lines, that we have much more in common than we have differences, and it's been working that way. And we're very thankful to the partners that we have, including some of the co-sponsors tonight who are from across organizational and denominational lines. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Jay Michaelson, whose bio I'm going to read in a moment. But first, I want to give folks a little bit of logistics. This is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting. So folks in the audience are not, your cameras don't work and your microphones don't either, but the chat works and the Q&A works. And we will leave, I believe, plenty of time for questions. We just ask that you keep them civil and on topic, but we hope to actually get a lot of good questions. And I think this is going to be a very engaging topic. So here's a bit about Jay Michaelson. He is a journalist, writer, and professor whose work focuses on the intersections of religion and politics. He is a columnist for The Forward, a contributor to Rolling Stone, and a frequent commentator on CNN, and was the Supreme Court columnist for the Daily Beast for 8 years. In 2013, Jay authored the first long-form report on the right-wing campaign to redefine religious liberty to curtail women's and LGBTQ rights. And in 2018, he broke the story of Leonard Leo's influence on US politics. Dr. Michaelson holds a PhD in Jewish thought from Hebrew University, a JD from Yale Law School, and non-denominational rabbinic ordination. He will be a visiting professor at Harvard Law School this spring, having previously held positions at Chicago Theological Seminary, Brown University, and Boston University Law School. Jay is also well known in the Jewish community as a teacher of spirituality and meditation. Dr. Michaelson is the author of 10 books, including God versus Gay, The Religious Case for Equality, a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and The Heresy of Jacob Frank, From Jewish Messianism to Esoteric Myth, by Oxford University Press, which won the National Jewish Book Award for Scholarship. Previously, Dr. Michaelson clerked for Judge Merrick Garland on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals and worked for 10 years as a professional LGBTQ activist. And that bio just scratches the surface, so I encourage all of you afterwards to go visit his website at jmichaelson.net, get onto his email list, and see all of the many expertise areas that he tackles regularly. So thank you so much, Jay, for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone for joining us.
And those of you who have been attending programs that we've done through Jews for Secular Democracy can see why I really feel Jay is at the perfect nexus of expertise to help us better understand the issues and challenges at hand, and at various points I'm probably going to ask you to put on your lawyer hat, put on your rabbi hat. But just to start, since the topic is Project 2025, and I believe most of the folks here have heard of it, though may not have a really deep understanding of what this is, can you give us a kind of broad overview of what is Project 2025, who's behind it, and how it seeks to remove the separation of church and state?
Absolutely. So I've been on a little journey with Project 2025. Like some other journalists, I was really startled to discover it in the springtime of this year. and really was agitating to somehow make it better known. It just seemed that this was so unusual. This was not like a typical Republican Party platform or anything like that. And it took a few months for that to happen. And a lot of us were kind of shouting in the wind. Now, it has become a news item. It's a trending hashtag, and it was featured in the debates, plural as well. And I think that's great. The more sunlight on this, the better. Now I think it may become, as somebody already alluded to in a question, like just the latest thing, to be debunked, like what is it for real? And so I think just for the next 5 minutes or so, I want to really just talk about it very directly, quoting from it even. So doesn't seem like it's just something that Democrats say or liberals say. If you're interested, I would say the first good long take on Project 2025 came from a journalist academic named Thomas Zimmer. I just pasted his first article on it in the chat. He's now written probably a dozen, so you can take a deeper dive there. So Project 2025 is not a new thing in and of itself. Every 4 years, the Heritage Foundation, a leading conservative think tank in DC, produces what they call a mandate for leadership, which is like what they'd like to see should the Republican candidate win the election. But this one is new in scope and in content. It's 922 pages, many, many writers. And I would say, if you remember one thing from this whole presentation, it is that this is not Reagan conservatism or Bush conservatism. This is authoritarianism. It's very different. If you think about Republicans for the last half century, they've generally favored smaller government, for example. This actually calls for an expansion of federal government power. So rather than try to kind of starve the beast, which was a language Republicans used to use to shrink federal government, it's to use federal government to institute a Christian nationalist agenda. Right? That's a big difference from all of the other Heritage Foundation mandates for leadership and for most what I would think of. That's why it was so shocking to read this. This just ran against what I understood the Republican Party to be for better or for worse. I didn't agree with it, but that's what they stood for. Project 2025 really has two parts, and we're going to focus on one of them, but both are equally important. One is a total remaking of federal government policies to implement Christian nationalist ideology. And the second, and I would say equally important, is kind of an HR personnel campaign. So this recruitment effort is already underway. It is a very large effort to recruit thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of MAGA ideologues, Christian nationalist ideologues, to fill what currently are civil service roles. Right. So without getting into the weeds, there is a possibility that up to about 50,000 jobs that are supposed to be non-political appointees could be reclassified by the executive. No need for Congress to get involved, as political appointees, and all of the people who do everything very, ordinary jobs in Department of Agriculture everywhere would be replaced by people who have already been vetted and who, profess allegiance and have demonstrated allegiance to this cause. That, again, is very new. That's never happened before in American history. It represents a complete remaking of what we understand to be the civil service. And from, let's say, from the right-wing perspective, this is how they get rid of the deep state. They're just going to fire everybody and replace them with MAGA loyalists. I would say another top line thing to understand about Project 2025 is it's really, the Hebrew word would be tshuva. It's repentance for what happened in 2017. In 2017, when Donald Trump won, very few people thought he was going to win. And the Republican establishment was caught by surprise. And so we had a lot of chaos in that first Trump term. People on the left said their incompetence saved us from their malevolence. Right? There were just, rotating scandals and a kind of a clown show. And I wrote a million articles back in that period about this kind of, gang of lunatics who were running the government. Well, they've learned their lesson. They're not going to repeat 2017. This time, there's going to be real discipline. They're going to be professionals. They're going to be in a very serious, way of taking power. So that's the very broad overview. I'll talk about details in just a minute. For people who know the Heritage Foundation, this is the new Heritage Foundation. This is not the Heritage Foundation of the Reagan years or the George W. Bush years. This is headed by an Opus Dey affiliate named Kevin Roberts, who has said, I'll quote, "We are in the process of the second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be." This is the head of the Heritage Foundation, which he said on July 3rd of this year. If the left allows it, it'll be bloodless. If not, presumably it will not be. There's a great article published today based on an equally great book by a scholar named Gareth Gore on Opus Dey and a kind of religious extremist takeover of a lot of the kind of the right-wing universe and the government as well. I put that in the comments as well. It's really a fantastic, if terrifying, read. So this is not like religious liberty, religious exemptions. This is religious authoritarianism. We've gone quite quickly from one to the other. So second major little area in this introduction. You've heard Donald Trump say he has nothing to do with Project 2025. One of the first question put in was Republicans say this is just more fake news. What do we say? What's true? 78% of the writers of the Project 2025 were in the Trump administration. So it is BS, or as our current president used to say, malarkey, that the Trump administration has nothing to do with this, including these are very high-ranking people who you can look up. These are not just random people. And in 2017, remember, Heritage has been putting these documents out for a while. Trump implemented over 60% of their policy recommendations that they made in 2016 when he took office in 2017. So, close to 2/3 became actual policies. So the idea that Trump has tried to, it's nice that he's trying to distance himself. It means we've done our job in telling people the truth about this. But it is certainly not the case that there's some firewall between the Trump administration and Heritage and these other authors. They are the same people. I would also say, in direct response to that question, if someone of a more conservative point of view says this is just the latest fake news, just tell them to read it. Right? This is not a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are secret. This is on the website, right? You could just Google Project 2025 and read it yourself. So you don't have to take some liberal journalist's, word for it. Tell them, use what the right always says, do your research. If you just read Project 2025, you'll see that the hyperbole that people sometimes use is not really hyperbole. It really is what we're saying. So that's, I would say, the first response is just do your research. And I'd say the only thing that could be still contested is like, does this have anything to do with Trump? But again, you can point to those numbers and specific names of people who were senior Trump people who wrote Project 2025. Okay, 2 more pieces in my introduction. First, just some general highlights. You can really Google a lot of this now, so I'm just going to very briefly go through them and then go to the 4 topics of specific interest to Jews, although maybe Paul pause actually and let you see if you want to ask before I do that part. So
yeah,
just
go ahead.
So the overall highlights, the big picture is, I think, more readily understandable than the little pictures because it really is extremely detailed. I had one example, I could have picked anyone. The National Institute of Standards and Technology at the Commerce Department. I don't even know what they do, but they said the new administration should ensure that any research conducted with taxpayer dollars serves the national interest in line with conservative principles. And you find this everywhere. I wasn't kidding about the Department of Agriculture. In every department, there is no stone left unturned. Again, I don't know what the National Institute of Standards Technology does or how they should change their research to align with conservative principles, but that's the big picture, the overall transformation of the government to be an engine of Christian conservatism. Specific examples, we know about mass deportations. We know about constructing possible detention camps, or you could call them concentration camps, in order for that to happen. There's a full federalization of things which used to be local. So if local law enforcement doesn't comply with, let's say, the mass deportations, the National Guard comes in, the government comes in. Massive redistribution of wealth to the ultra rich with a flat tax, with a Medicaid cap, ending Head Start, ending student loan forgiveness, repealing all of the Inflation Reduction Act and rolling back all climate policies. EPA is supposed to reform scientific research, again, in line with conservative values. Another specific example, I'll quote from what should happen to the Department of Health and Human Services. So now I'm quoting, HHS should return to being known as the Department of Life by explicitly rejecting the notion that abortion is healthcare. HHS should use every available tool, including the cutting of funds, to ensure that every state reports exactly how many abortions take place within its borders, at what gestational age of the child, for what reason, the mother's state of residence, and by what method. So this ends, Project 2025 ends federalism, right? Which used to be another bedrock Republican value. It ends the idea that if you live in a comfortable blue state, You don't have to be, you're not at risk the same way as someone who lives in a red state, right? Every state is supposed to track every abortion that takes place and every woman and every provider. That is extremely chilling, right? Going after DAs and attorney generals who refuse to prosecute, going after anything that looks like a sanctuary city, and having a national surveillance program for anyone seeking abortion. These are not small changes. And again, you can drill down. If we had more time, I could bore you with all of the details of exactly how which departments do what and how that's operationalized.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the piece that I'm so glad we're able to have this conversation, because I feel like for a lot of folks who are getting the top line story, there's this massive thing, it's 900 pages and it's really bad, but being able to actually articulate what is it that's so bad? Like, what are they specifically saying? You know, using the government to track women and where they go and what they do is, as you said, it's chilling and just very disturbing, and it's written out. We're not extrapolating from vagueness. It's very clear in there. You did this in a piece that you wrote for the forward you gave specific examples, and in particular, and the piece was titled Why Project 2025 Would Be the End of the American Jewish Dream. So you pulled out some specifics about why this would be specifically bad for the Jews. So can you go into some details now about that?
Sure, absolutely. So I want to just say at the outset, all of this is bad for Judaism and Jews the way we, progressives think about it. I don't want to suggest that only, that ending same-sex marriage and ending what they call the toxic normalization of transgenderism, that affects Jews as well as everyone else. But I'm going to zoom in on specifically impacts on the Jewish community for this next little part. The first is the changed relationship of the Department of Justice and the FBI to the White House. Right now, the Department of Justice is semi-independent, and so is the FBI. Donald Trump hates this, right? He's still thinking about the Russia investigations from his first presidential term. And Project 25 spells out in a lot of detail that DOJ and FBI should answer to the president. So now let's step back. The overwhelming majority of violent anti-Semitic attacks from the Tree of Life on down are perpetrated by right-wing Christian nationalists. So if the FBI and DOJ is now serving a Christian nationalist and a white Christian nationalist agenda, who's going to prevent the next massacre before it takes place? I mean, Donald Trump has said that the Christian nationalist insurrectionists on January 6th were heroes. He says he has vowed to release all of them from prison. This is all the same movement. Do we really believe for a moment that a Christian nationalist DOJ or FBI will go after Christian nationalist groups and chat rooms and networks that incubate and encourage terrorists? Right? I don't want to trivialize it by saying it's putting the fox in charge of the hen house, to use that cliche, but this is putting the same people who are perpetrating or tolerating or instigating these acts of violence in charge of preventing the acts of violence. Second, there is the state surveillance of, quote, radical agents of the left. That term isn't defined. I've been called a radical agent. This is of the left. I've also been called an agent of the right by people further to my left. But the building out of a national state surveillance system for anyone progressive, and I think that includes some large percentage of American Jews, is deeply worrying. There's a massive attack on public education and a boost to private sectarian education, ending Title I at the main education aid program, boosting private schools. Some yeshivas will benefit, but the kind of American dream of public school as we know it will end. And again, it depends where you are on the Jewish spectrum. Dennis Prager, who is on the board of the Oklahoma School Reform Commission. So if you like more Bible in public schools, and if you like more private schools and fewer public schools at all, this is a plus. But I think that's a poor bet, given the number of American Jews relative to the number of conservative Christians. And I think the last thing I want to say is the whole document institutes Christianity as the national religion of America. Steve Bannon has said that Jews should yoke ourselves to Christian nationalism in order to survive. I'm not sure that's a good bet. But how does that happen? Even again, like an example that in talking about COVID era health regulations, Project 2025 asks, what is the proper balance of lives saved versus souls saved? Right, that religious calculation, this is about because people couldn't go to churches and synagogues in the height of the pandemic, right, that should be part of American policymaking. We don't have to really look very far to see what this world would look like, because in some of these isolated communities, where they have had this power already, they've already put it in. Brad Onishi, who's a wonderful scholar of Christian nationalism, put it this way, and with this I'll then end this answer. The Christian nationalists view the second Trump presidency as a permission structure for cultural violence and social domination. People see it as a time for revenge, time to get back at those who stole the election in 2020. You don't believe in the right God. You don't have the right ethnicity. You are conspiring to undermine our religion and our country. I think if you listen to Trump, if you watch a Trump rally, if you attend a Trump rally, Onishi really hits that sensibility really well. I'll copy and paste that quote into the comment as well. Whatever's happening on the policy level is, I think, dangerous enough, but we really do want to think about what happens on a cultural level and what this looks like, what this so-called Second American Revolution is meant to look like. And I see it as a queer person just traveling to Florida, traveling to places where there are attacks on the LGBTQ community. The attacks themselves may be limited to school curriculum, book banning, or so forth. But I like Onishi's phrasing here, a permission structure for cultural violence and social domination. And the idea that I think is maybe the most chilling part, what's not even written in Project 2025, but the cultural change it hopes to bring about.
It's a great point. And, I think a lot of people today are worried about what might happen to Haitian people in Springfield, Ohio, based on that kind of permission. There's already tons of bomb threats and stuff based on.
That's a great analogy, right? Yeah. I mean, one outrageous conspiracy theory, which was quickly sort of a joke, quickly became not a joke, right? Because when you say something like that, the so-called, lone wolves of the world come out of the woodwork. Yeah. And that I think is an excellent microcosm of the world that Project 2025 seeks to create.
Well, that is certainly the scary piece. I want to go back to what you had said about their incompetence saved us, and I understand that they're ready now. But if they do retake the executive branch, how realistic is it, do you think, that they'll be able to actually implement Project 2025? That's kind of the part one. And the part two is, even if they don't retake the executive branch, I think, ringing success that their movement has had is our current Supreme Court, which may be able to do much of that damage just on their own. So how much of it is realistic if they win? How much of it is going to happen anyway, even if they don't win?
The Supreme Court is my answer to your first part of the question, but I think it takes two to tango. The court can allow a lot of things to happen, but it does not have the kind of power to initiate these kind of actions. So, I'll take something you take mass deportations, for example. Supreme Court can't make that happen. What they can do is rubber stamp, as they often did in the first Trump administration, rubber stamp these policies. We saw, and I think the New York Times' coverage of Chief Justice Roberts' role in this was quite chilling. We saw in the last year that the court is willing to create new doctrine in order to legitimize the efforts of Donald Trump and the Christian nationalist movement, right? Creating presidential immunity out of thin air. It doesn't exist in the Constitution. There's just a pretext of separation of powers. That's one example. We can look at Supreme Court cases which, in the darkest chapters of our history, the Korematsu decision in World War II, which allowed Japanese internment camps. So it's easy to see. We don't have to fantasize about the future. We can look at the court's past and see how, when the court is taken over or is dominated, let's say, by a particular ideological view, it can allow a lot to happen. I don't think except some things that are already happening on state and local levels. I don't think the Supreme Court can initiate most, if not, I don't think really any of the changes that are called for in Project 2025, with the exception of things that are already judicially created. Do I think that there will be a national right to same-sex marriage 2 years from now? I do not. Am I making personal plans about what my husband and myself and my daughter are planning to do when that happens? Yes. So that is something that the court can do. But a lot of this around changing funding to schools, for example, or tax policy, things like that, some of these require Congress, but most of them do require the executive.
Great, thank you. And it is just scary. So I'm hoping you'll be able to provide us with some kind of ray of hope beyond just voting. Are there things that we can be doing as Jews, like the values that we might be able to voice, or as activists that we can do to kind of try to counter, if not the implementation, at least the messaging around Christian nationalism and Project 2025?
So it's funny, I am someone who sees bad news as good news. So when Ron DeSantis kind of got over his skis on attacking wokeness, I was pleased because I don't want to minimize the people he put in danger, certainly trans populations and others, but when he did that, he moved too far to the right, too far from the middle. And Project 2025 does the same thing. Going back to that first question about, how somebody tells me that my conservative friend tells me this is just fake news. Well, why are they saying that? It's because they themselves wouldn't stomach Project 2025, right? This is too far right for right of center moderates, right? And so that is why, in a certain way, I don't want to be misquoted, but in a certain way, Project 2025 is good news because it's just too far outside the mainstream. It's another reason why I'm a big fan of J.D. Vance, right? This is not a kind of figure who appeals to moderates, right? He appeals to the base, but he doesn't appeal to swing voters. So that means there is a space for what I would call retail activism. On the part of, we all have friends, especially in the Jewish community, right? There are a lot of Jews who have a somewhat more hawkish Israel view than I might have, and who are concerned about, the different administrations on Israel, and who might be on the fence, right? Not the already ones who have already set sail for Trump, but people who might be still on the fence. And to kind of see that it's a package deal, that when you vote Donald Trump, you don't only get support for Bibi in Israel, but you also get Project 2025 with the national abortion ban, with the national abortion database, which, by the way, does not require any action from Congress, right? Because it's tied to funding and things like that. You get all of these shifts in terms of instituting Christian religious doctrine into American government. You get all of this. And we're not, I think, in a funny way, I remember, I've been following Jews for Secular Democracy for a while, right? I can't think of anything more antithetical to a secular democracy than this. It's neither secular nor a democracy. And I remember 10 years ago being upset about, religious exemptions and the cake baker who wouldn't bake the cake for the gay couple. We are way, way past that now. We are in a very different place where the appeal to heaven flag is, flying over Justice Alito's home, whoever put it up there. That we are no longer looking at separation of church and state. We're looking at the takeover of the state by the church. And but again, this is good news because this is not what soccer moms in my suburban New Jersey town, I'm in a liberal dot, so not mine, but this is not where the middle of America is. This is way far beyond that. And so I don't want to sound naive here, but the truth really is on our side. And I think the reason why there's so much denial of Project 2025 is if people really admitted the truth of it, they would be back into a conflict about who to vote for.
I want to believe. That's one way, but the other is that we go into authoritarianism, which is what you described. And there was actually a quote in the Times from, I think he's a mega pastor, Sam Brownback, in which he said, quote, "God never needs a majority. All he needs is a faithful remnant," right? They're actually aware that they're not in the majority on these issues and see them, and like the whole like voter suppression piece is also because they know it's not, if this was a genuine Democratic vote, they'd lose. So how can they get power in other ways?
Yeah, no, look, that's absolutely right. And it's been growing for 30 years. I remember actually it was when in the Clinton impeachment, when I think it would have been the 1998 midterms, the Democrats actually won after the impeachment. And this is like a historical thing for most of us. But at the time, a lot of the Christian right really felt like, forget it. Like America just voted in the party of sin, the party that's supporting this guy. We need to look at non-democratic means to change the society. And obviously, all of the work that Leonard Leo's done on the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but the entire federal court system, is to bring that about. I think one thing I would want to say, I think growing up with my Jewish background and upbringing, I sort of see these guys as like the big bad, the bad guys who are like big and powerful compared to the Jewish community. It's worth noting that they do not see themselves that way. There is a real sense, and this, I don't think it's a pose. I feel strongly it's not a pose. They really do see themselves as like the faithful remnant, as the embattled martyrs. They are aware that they are losing these cultural battles in America, and that they're losing the demographic battles from a sort of racist perspective, right? America is becoming, and these are facts, right? America is becoming less white. It is becoming less white dominated. It is becoming less traditional in its moral outlook, according to these traditions. So they're not wrong that they are losing ground. And if you again read Project 2025 yourself, you really see that Onishi quote about this being revenge is spot on. There's a real sense of like, we are at the last battleground, and we have to use every tool possible to fight because we are losing. And this effort, Project 2025, is not the effort, let's say, of like the giant empire crushing the rebellion. They see themselves as the rebellion. This is for Star Wars people out there, right? They see themselves.
Who's not a Star Wars person? Everyone is a Star Wars.
I'll let that go. That is how, and so I think it's helpful psychologically, also in terms of empathy, but just to sort of understand that is how this part of the population sees itself. They don't see themselves as the big bullies implementing Christianity. They see themselves as desperately trying to save an America that probably can't be saved, right? Even with all of these, horrifying policies, we have changed. And, I want to take a line from Kamala Harris, but, I don't think we're going back. But in a profound way, we're not going back, even if all of these things become policies, even if we're living in Gilead.
And since you mentioned Leonard Leo, do you want to let folks know who he is in case they don't?
Sure. So, and I did link to this new article that just went out today in New York Magazine about Opus Dey, the conservative Catholic network that Leo was not formally a part of, but is close to. Leonard Leo is the person who picked all of Donald Trump's 3 Supreme Court justices. He was de facto running the Federalist Society, as well as Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason, as well as the Judicial Crisis Network, which helped defeat Merrick Garland's nomination and helped advance all of Donald Trump's nominations. And I've left out one of you. Oh, and he was active, was not running, was also active in the Becket Fund, which won some of the early religious exemption cases. Leonard Leo has been very clear in his statements, which have been recorded, that he is aware that an anti-democratic battle needs to be fought in order for these values to prevail. But he is absolutely convinced of the rightness of his religious beliefs, which are conservative Catholic ones, that there is a true moral order, and that's what's at stake. And so you do what you have to do. So a lot of the rhetoric that we might be familiar with from the pro-life movement has now been sort of generalized into all of these other areas as well. I'm seeing
Right.
Katie put up one of the Q&As. So it's a funny thing about the Project 2025 and 501c3s discussing it. Donald Trump's claim that Project 2025 has nothing to do with his campaign means that we can talk about Project 2025. I mean, I am an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice right now, but I am pointing out that the campaign claims that it's not a campaign document. It's created by the Heritage Foundation. And I do think it doesn't mention Donald Trump's name. Right? It just keeps saying the next Republican president, the next Republican president. And I think if the concern really is 501c3 status, first of all, if Project 2025 gets enacted, this will be the least of the RAC's problems. But if that is actually the concern, I think if it's just talking about the issues that are put in this policy document without referencing the election, to me that is a way to talk about it and use Trump's claim as a defense.
We've tried to be very careful around the Johnson Amendment and what we can and can't do as a 501c3, even though my understanding is it's not enforced. But we still believe in it, and we do not endorse any candidate. We take positions on issues, and especially Jews for Secular Democracy. You know, there is nobody can speak with one voice for all Jews. But when you look at Jewish support for LGBTQ equality, it's in like the 85th percentile, right? And for abortion access, it's also in that range. Like it's as close on any issues that there are to have consensus in the Jewish community. So I don't feel like this is, I don't feel like we're in jeopardy here, because we're talking about like the issues that these folks want to have implemented in our country, and trying to find ways to push back on them.
I think that's right. I also think if you compare this conversation to any sermon that Mark Robinson gave in North Carolina over the last 5 years in a church, there was a reason why folks may not be aware Johnson Amendment prohibited religious organizations from getting involved in politics in certain ways, and Trump got rid of it. And there was a real reason for that. People were voting in church. They're passing out absentee ballots and voting in church, and the pastor was watching you vote and fill out the ballot. I wasn't looking over your shoulder, I assume, but still you're in that space. So yeah, we're very clear of there. I wanted to jump to another point that was made in the chat questions, if that's all right, Paul.
Sure.
There was somebody said, you know, it's not really helpful to say this will destroy our democracy. What would you emphasize to potential voters to motivate them? I agree. I think destroy democracy is not the winning phrase. First of all, you know, we've seen, I would not have seen the Harris campaign coming. You know, her team and she have made a decision to emphasize as much of the positive as they can, rather than scaring people into not voting for Donald Trump. And they're smarter than I am. So I think that's probably, you know, I think it's true that making certainly vague statements, but I do, so I agree. I think it might be about cherry picking out some of the very specific points in Project 2025. It could even be, so abortion is, I think, maybe the easiest one, especially for, as you noted, the numbers on abortion, but also climate change, which you wouldn't think would be a sort of religious issue, but is. Most Americans do want some degree of action to fight climate change. We're feeling it directly. The Yale Center for Climate Communication, which talks about how to talk about climate change, said that the best thing you can do to open up a conversation is not tell someone about climate change, but ask them to tell you about some change that they've noticed in their own lives. Maybe like the fishing pond where they like to go fishing, or the place where they used to vacation. And then move from that to, should we scrap all climate rules? Did you know that that's the plan? And that is in the Trump platform as well as in Project 2025, but just staying on Project 2025. So I think if it's on an individual level, not as the questioner asked, writing postcards, but if it's a conversation, seeing where someone is on one of these issues. Because again, even if you're talking to a moderate or even a conservative, somebody pointed out in the chat, we shouldn't really even see this as conservatism. I try not to use the word fascism too much because I don't want to drain that word of its meaning. I don't disagree with its application in some cases, but this is not conservatism, right? It's something really different. And I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. I think conservatives in America for at least 50 years have talked about less government and have talked about more freedom. And again, I'm not really on board with what that means. However, that's what conservatives have said. And this is the exact opposite. This is a much bigger federal government and a much bigger surveillance state. Do you think that the federal government should keep tabs on the names and locations and ages and reasons why every woman in every state in this country who's seeking an abortion, why she's doing that? Again, that's way, way out to the right of where the American center right is, of course, not where progressives are. And that should be scary. And I think, I'll say one other thing. And when I was working, so I was the Supreme Court columnist of the Daily Beast in the first Trump administration. And I often was demoralized because I felt like I was just preaching to the choir, right? So there wasn't, conservatives, Daily Beast actually had an interesting way of reaching a wide audience, but in general, I felt like I wasn't reaching the people I wanted to reach. But you know what? The choir actually showed up and sang in 2020, right? There is a lot, I think, as we've switched, a lot of people are in despair around Joe Biden, and now there might be some in complacency around Kamala Harris. There is no space for complacency in this moment. And so preach to the choir, especially if the choir is living in a swing state, but even if they're not. So I think even if it's not having those difficult conversations, it's important to just make sure that people who might be a little complacent don't let that complacency dictate their actions.
I think that's a great point. I also think that the thinking in the Harris campaign, and again, I'm glad to see that she's got smart people working on this, is who are they speaking to? And they're speaking to that sliver of America that's still somehow undecided. I don't know anybody who's undecided. I would love to have a conversation with someone to understand how they're still undecided. But I think you're right that they really thought about how are we going to convince the folks who are undecided. So to me, also not just the choir, but like the folks who are in between the choir and the folks who are decided for authoritarianism is what are the compelling messages? And I think you're spot on as far as you want more state surveillance, right? And which is, who's proposing that? So
right. And I think
that's the struggle, I think.
I have a little, the undecideds kind of drive me crazy too, but I do think, I've tried to look into really like what are motivating people who are undecided, right? Inflation is real. It actually is down over the last few months, but it's up over the last 4 years. Prices are up. Ironically, Trump's policies, whether it's tariffs or, it's sort of more supply side economics, would almost certainly make everything much worse. But that's already too in the weeds. The reality is, a dozen eggs costs more than it did before. And people are feeling that. And really, I think, a more progressive, more Bernie Sanders-ish economic program would actually address those issues. But that's, again, we're already kind of in the weeds, right? There is that sense, right? And I think, again, in the Jewish community, I don't want to minimize people's trauma from October 7th or what's happened with both the real and perceived rise in anti-Semitism. And I think there are people who are a little on the fence, but again, and people who may just have somewhat conservative values in some way, but this is so far beyond where that is. One person just asked, which a question I hadn't seen before, as I'm kind of liking it, is what will this be like? Like, what would really change for an average, family? If let's say all Project 2025 happens, maybe they're not really politically active or particularly religious. Well, first I would say if they have kids, my daughter's in public school. We think of it as pretty safe. It's a great school district and, aligns with my liberal politics. But every public school in the country depends on some federal funding. And if that gets totally wiped out, unless it gets replaced, and if then other kinds of funding are conditioned on having certain curricula, which is all in Project 2025, on banning certain books, on studying the Bible, then the public school experience changes immediately, right? For anyone who has children who are in the public school system. I think secondly, anyone who either is or values someone female immediately has their freedoms rolled back, even if it's not somebody who's immediately seeking reproductive health care. Let's also, I didn't even mention this. I don't know how effective this would be without congressional action. Project 2025 wants a national ban on contraception. They want a national ban on IVF. They want very restrictive regulation on pornography, right? So it's not only, I don't want to minimize, just say only abortion. Abortion's not the only area of serious concern in regulating our private lives. I have a number of friends who have trans kids. Roger Severino, who was one of Trump's appointees in the Department of Health and Human Services, who wrote the HHS part of Project 2025, has made countless statements saying that transgender identity, which is recognized by the AMA and everybody else, is actually either a form of kind of social contagion or mental illness, that trans affirming healthcare is child abuse. And so that directly impacts my friends' families. And again, I think there's a tendency many of us have, Paul, you said, I used to live in Park Slope with you, we're in like the little bubble, in our little Brooklyn bubble, and we think we're safe. But when this is nationalized, New York State and will have to make a choice between defending the schools the way they are, defending trans people, defending women, and they'll make a choice between that and some kind of fiscal survival. And again, this isn't like just a wish list, because they've had a few years to think over how this didn't happen in the first Trump term.
I thought that was a great question too, because also, if you can think about, first of all, I don't know that there is this average household anymore, and that's kind of this idealized vision, but what are the messages that might convince them? And I think you spelled out a number of really good ones. We've been using this phrase Christian nationalist, and every time we do a program about this, I always want to make the disclaimer that we're not talking about all Christians, that there are great groups like Christians Against Christian Nationalism, there's Catholics for Choice. This is not the consensus opinion among Christian Americans.
It's also not very Christian.
Right. Well, that's for sure.
It's Christian identity, obviously,
right.
but
right.
There's very little, and there's some great studies done that the people who are, let's say marching with crosses on January 6th are not going to church that much. Right. These are not, these are not the people who are, so obviously American evangelicalism is predominantly quite conservative, but this is already a little bit different from that. These are people who understand their Christianity, and obviously people should define their faith however they want, but just to understand it, they understand their Christianity in terms of support for this agenda. Like, America should be a Christian nation. America was founded as a Christian nation. We need to get back to being a Christian nation. And what that actually means are some of the issues we've talked about before, not, blessed are the poor or taking care of the least of these or anything of that nature.
Do you have a sense of what it is, though, that they do believe? Do they see themselves as practicing a religion, or do they understand that it's kind of ethno-nationalism? And what is the theology there?
Yeah, I mean, there's been Brad Onishi's written a lot about it, who I mentioned before, and others have as well. Catherine Stewart has done some really good work on this. There's that book, The Power Worshippers. I mean, that's part of it. Since the 1970s, so very, very short history thing, until the civil rights movement, until the 1960s, most conservative Christians felt they wanted to stay out of politics. Politics was kind of, just a zone of sin and worldliness, and they should be concerned with other things. With civil rights for people of color in America, it's sometimes told this was a reaction to abortion, but actually it was a reaction to integration, as Randall Balmer has showed in several books at this point. That changed, and conservative Christians became more involved in politics. Evangelicals in particular and Catholics used to really strongly dislike each other. They never worked together. It was opposition to racial integration first and then abortion second that brought them together to form the sort of new Christian right. And so since the mid 70s, so now for, 50 years, there has been a Christian identity defined in terms of political activism. And it's, I checked. Jesus said very little about guns and the Second Amendment in the Gospels, but it's a lot about that. It's a lot about life as understood in this particular ideology, and it's tacitly about returning to an America that never was, that was a Christian nation and held to its dear pieties. And what decade was that, right? I mean, that's the thing people ask about Make America Great Again. I mean, was it the 50s when there was institutionalized segregation, when there was Jim Crow? Is it maybe the 80s? Maybe that was better, when there was certainly no rights for LGBTQ people, and in which we could routinely, there was certainly no Me Too, and the sexual mores between men and women were so different and more oppressive. it's this imagined return to a previous time when we were a Christian nation, but when you kind of look under the hood of what that really means, it meant a time when we were more white, more dominated by Christianity and by conservative morality. It doesn't have a kind of theological content for that section. But I also want to add, hasten to add, it's a broad movement, right? There are many folks who are very theologically minded. So something like 70% of US evangelicals say that they believe the rapture will happen in their lifetimes. And there's a messianic movement or current in some parts of Christian nationalism. So there's no Christian nationalist pope. If there were, it'd probably be Trump, but there isn't one. There's no uniform doctrine or dogma. So we speak sort of in terms of, these are some of the issues that appear over and over again, but I don't want to suggest that it's a monolith since it's not.
Right. And someone put in the chat what I was going to say, a return to white male supremacy. I mean, there is and I would say, of course, white male heterosexual supremacy. It's about power. And there's a meme of, what would you fear? The fear of the chant of Jews will not replace us is about white people in America demographically no longer being the supermajority or a majority. And the meme is kind of, well, what would you fear about being a minority? Is it how you've been treating minorities this whole way through?
Right.
So it's, and you mentioned parts of Brooklyn where I live, and one of the reasons I live here and I love it and I pay the stupid rent that I do is because there is no majority in my kids' schools. It is a minority majority. There is no single majority, and I think that's beautiful. So I'm one of those Jews looking to replace it. But
we know that it's true, yeah. Right? I mean, I grew up in Florida in the 1980s and 90s, and I remember, I mean, we made jokes that would be beyond offensive now. We were horrible to forget ableist. We were well beyond that, right? We were terrible. And we were also, it was a much more white male dominated culture at that time. And I think now of like all of the Latino and Latina people on pop charts, our culture, I say in a lot of my writing, you have to press 1 to have it in English instead of primo numero dos to have it in Spanish. That drives people bananas. And if you were invested, I suspect you weren't so invested in that white dominated time, when you were growing up either. But if you were, they have lost that, right? And it's this inability to see the gifts of diversity, obviously, and multiculturalism, but they're not wrong about some of the changes that have taken place in America over the last 50 years. I would just say, I'm sure you would agree, they're just wrong about whether that's for the better or for the worse. But I do understand that and I wasn't really part of that dominant group. Obviously, I was a white male, right? But I was Jewish, right? I was queer and closeted. I was a nerd. I didn't like go to football games. Like I wasn't part of that dominant culture anyway. I thought it was stupid. And if I had been maybe more in the dominant group, maybe I would miss it more. And it's such a tragedy in a way, right? That here, what we were calling a few years ago the white working class, but this sort of large group of white Americans who are really suffering. They're suffering with an opioid crisis. They're suffering with loss of status and with loss of economic opportunity, partly because our education system doesn't prepare them to live in the 21st century. They are actually experiencing a lot of pain, but it's been channeled as it has been by demagogues across history, right, including in Nazi Germany, but not just that. It's been channeled not into an economic and social program that could actually help, but into this hate against the other. And this version that's in Project 2025 is just a particularly articulate version. You won't hear this detailed level of proposal at a Trump rally. You'll just hear the broadsides, the eating the dogs and the cats. But what's beneath that is that these immigrants are seen to be less than human. And therefore, it's fine to round them up and to racially profile everyone, because how are you going to tell who's undocumented and who's not? Because they're not really like us anyway. And that underneath it, it's like not losing the forest for the trees, I think, to see that that's the reality.
and I think the piece about who's the other in the Jewish community is a fascinating and interesting challenge. I think most Jews understand that we're the other, but I think there's a pretty significant percentage that thinks we are included in, like, when the far right uses phrases like Judeo-Christian, right? Like, or that the what I think is a myth that Trump would be better on Israel. Those kind of things, I think there is a significant percent of Jews, not the majority, who think we're white and we, and so we're in this, we're included. By the way, I didn't grow up in multicultural Brooklyn. I grew up in stifling Staten Island, and in the 80s, and there was absolutely stuff that we did that if there had been social media, all of us would have had our careers destroyed before they ever got started, and that was just how it was in the 80s. And I don't miss it because I think we're in a better place of inclusion. So, someone wrote in one of the questions about that piece. I'm losing it now. It was in the Q&A, and now it seems to be gone. But that Jews are included in the other, and how might we help the 30% who may think, no, we're included in this plan, in this positive, bringing America back to greatness of the 50s. Like, Jews in the 50s didn't have it so well,
That's right.
We had the Catskills because we couldn't go anywhere else, those kind of things.
I think there is, so, there's been some talk about this back and forth in the chat too. I think, if I remember, one of my mother's friends said, he was a single issue voter and that issue was Israel. And if you have a particular hawkish, right-wing view on Israel, yeah, I mean, Trump has more or less said he's going to allow Israel to annex the West Bank. So that will further that agenda. I would say not for better or for worse, but just for worse. But that will happen. But at what price? Right. So you will get that. I'm not denying that someone with a more right-wing view will get some of what they want from Trump on Israel, but at a cost of, J.D. Vance is doing a rally with Tucker Carlson next week. Tucker Carlson just had a Holocaust denier and a virulent anti-Semite on his show, agreed with him, and J.D. Vance is still sharing a stage with him. This isn't like cancel culture to say that this is problematic. So now we have to put up with Holocaust denial. We have to put up with not going after white nationalist terrorists who are targeting Jews. We have to go along with instituting Christian understandings of religion in public schools. We have to go along with not having a real independent DOJ and FBI. So I think there's a real naivete, a false complacency. And I would urge those Jews, this is too late. This advice would never be taken anyway, but it's too late anyway. I'm blanking on the name, the Tom Stoppard play about his family in, I think it was in Austria and in Germany before World War II, where they were very comfortable, and there were conservative members of that family who thought they could accommodate themselves to the rising fascism. I'm not saying that Trumpism is fascism and Nazi Germany. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's a degree of complacency and comfort that Jews in particular can get when we're successful at assimilating, until the real anti-Semites show us that we never fully assimilated as much as we thought we did. And I really do believe that whether it's the Dershowitzes or it's nice that I can't remember his name, the Dennis Pragers of the world, who really believe that, like Steve Bannon said, we can just kind of yoke ourselves to Christian nationalism and have the Judeo-Christian values. I just think that's astonishingly naive and and shocking to see.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I know that there is so much here, and I do think that you are able to provide our folks with some really good specifics that they'll be able to use in their own advocacy. So I really appreciate it. I'm sure all of us will be following your work, and I'm sure it's going to be intense for the next 6 weeks or so. But thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure. And I hope our conversation demystifies Project 2025 a bit. It's not from planet Mars. This is very real. We don't have to use exaggerated language to talk about it. We can let it speak for itself. And that is more than scary enough.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a great night, everybody. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the wonderful questions. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.